Hello, dear friends, and welcome to our charming little village of Marleycombe. Today, we are about to step into a story that has captivated hearts for generations. The curse behind Dolly Bantry's necklace, a Miss Marple Mystery. Imagine, if you will, a crisp autumn morning, leaves swirling and crunching underfoot, and the delicate aroma of freshly baked seed cake drifting from the village tea-room. On the surface, all is calm, but beneath that gentle veneer, secrets stir, and old rivalries whisper in shadowed corners. Tell me, if you discovered a family heirloom said to carry a curse, would you dare wear it, or tuck it away safely? Let us uncover the mystery together, and see what Marleycombe truly hides. The sun shone gently over Marleycombe that summer afternoon, casting a warm glow on the Bantry garden, where roses bloomed in perfect order and the air was sweet with their fragrance. Guests strolled leisurely, delicate china cups in hand, nibbling on dainty cakes, while a small string quartet played softly in the background. Laughter mingled with the hum of polite conversation, and all seemed charmingly serene, until a sudden gasp rippled through the gathering. Dolly Bantry, ever the picture of composure, had toppled forward, her hand clutching the sparkling necklace that rested over her heart. Shocked cries filled the garden as neighbors hurried to her side, while whispers of a curse, long rumored to haunt the Bantry family, drifted like shadows across the manicured lawns. The local doctor arrived promptly, checking her pulse, reassuring yet concerned. Meanwhile, Miss Marple remained on the periphery, her sharp eyes noting every subtle reaction, a too hasty glance, a hand brushing nervously against a sleeve, a whispered exclamation held just a moment too long. The heirloom, a glittering chain with a history as tangled as the village gossip, had become the center of attention. And in that instant, Marleycombe's calm surface rippled, hinting at secrets that would unravel slowly, but with inevitable consequence. The stage was set, and the mystery began. Chapter 1. Whispers over Seed Cake. The scent of freshly brewed tea and warm, buttery seed cake wafted through the small tea-room at the heart of Marleycombe, wrapping the room in a comforting embrace. Yet, beneath the cozy chatter and clinking of porcelain cups, an undercurrent of unease hummed like a secret note, barely audible but impossible to ignore. News of Dolly Bantry's collapse had traveled faster than the autumn wind, and now the villagers huddled in small clusters, whispering, speculating, and occasionally glancing toward the door as though expecting the very walls to spill more secrets. "I heard she simply fainted, poor soul," murmured Mrs. Weatherby, her hands fluttering over her teacup like nervous birds. "But then again, there have been stories, haven't there? About that cursed necklace." Mrs. Hargreaves, ever more inclined to a dramatic flourish, leaned closer. "Cursed, you say? Nonsense! But some say, well, it wasn't an accident. Someone must have done this on purpose." Her eyes darted around, eager to catch a nod of agreement, or at least a gasp of sympathy. Miss Marple sat quietly at her usual corner table, a delicate china cup untouched before her. She observed the room with her habitual patience, her gaze flicking from one nervous neighbor to another. Each villager's tone, each hesitation, each slip of a word was a brushstroke on the canvas of the day's events, revealing more than they themselves suspected. A passing glance from Mr. Price, who seemed more concerned with his garden than gossip, lingered just a moment too long. Mrs. Hargreaves' insistence on emphasizing the word purpose carried an edge that belied her shock. Even the timid waitress, who had been refilling cups with trembling hands, seemed to avert her eyes from one particular table. The tea-room's cozy warmth contrasted sharply with the subtle tension in the air. Conversations overlapped, fragments of stories forming a web, a missed appointment, a suspicious visitor in the garden, a letter arriving just days before the party. Some accounts conflicted, others omitted crucial details. Miss Marple listened, piecing together the inconsistencies with quiet precision. Where others saw merely chatter, she saw patterns. The threads of the day's mystery, delicate and almost invisible, were beginning to reveal themselves to the observant eye. A hush fell as the door opened, and a new villager entered, pale-faced, whispering hurriedly about what he had seen on the garden path. Heads turned, questions hung in the air. Yet through it all, Miss Marple remained serene, sipping a moment from her cup, letting the rumors swirl and the villagers' truths, or half-truths, emerge naturally. It was in these whispers, these fleeting admissions and subtle contradictions, that the seeds of understanding took root. And already she suspected that what seemed a simple collapse was anything but ordinary. The tea-room, with its lace curtains fluttering gently in the afternoon breeze, became a stage upon which curiosity, fear, and intrigue played out, a quiet prologue to the unraveling mystery that would soon grip Marleycombe in ways no one yet imagined. By the time the afternoon sunlight began to slant through the tea-room windows, golden and warm, the gentle hum of conversation had thickened into a dense cloud of speculation. Gossip, as it often did in Marleycombe, had taken on a life of its own. Mrs. Hargreaves leaned toward Mrs. Weatherby, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Did you notice the way Mr. Bantry was clutching that letter before the garden party? Quite peculiar, wasn't it?" Mrs. Weatherby nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes, and I swear I saw young Peter lingering near the roses with a look that, well, one might call suspicious." Across the room, a group of older ladies shook their heads in dismay. "A curse, I tell you. That necklace has brought nothing but trouble," murmured Mrs. Crandall, her knitting needles clicking nervously as if their rhythmic motion could ward off the unseen menace. First the fire at Marigold House, then old Mrs. Pennington's broken leg, and now this. Miss Marple, seated calmly in her usual corner, observed all of this with a quiet smile that betrayed none of her inner calculations. Each snippet of conversation was like a pebble tossed into still water, rippling outward and revealing hidden patterns. The fear in the villagers' voices was genuine, but it was interlaced with curiosity, curiosity sharpened to a fine edge by long-simmering rivalries and unspoken resentments. The tension in the tea-room was almost tangible. Even the normally cheerful waitress approached her duties with an anxious gait, avoiding the eyes of the most outspoken gossipers. Miss Marple noticed how some villagers sought reassurance from each other, while others seemed eager to fan the flames of rumor, their subtle glances betraying a desire for drama. The interplay of fear and fascination fascinated her, human nature always revealing more than words alone could convey. Outside, the wind rustled the fallen autumn leaves, a faint echo of unease that seemed to creep in through the slightly ajar window. Miss Marple's eyes followed the patterns of villagers' movements, the way they crossed and recrossed the room, where their attention lingered and where it darted away. There were contradictions, small hesitations, moments when one statement failed to align with another. These were the invisible threads that would guide her later, connecting seemingly trivial actions into a tapestry of motives and opportunity. For now, The villagers spoke of curses and accidents, of hidden grievances and jealousies, completely unaware that Miss Marple's quiet attention had already begun to sift truth from exaggeration. The ordinary chatter of the tea-room had transformed into a subtle, living puzzle. And somewhere within those whispers, that uneasy blend of fear and fascination, lay the key to understanding what had truly happened to Dolly Bantry and the mysterious heirloom that had sparked it all. The village, seemingly calm beneath the cozy veneer of tea and cake, held secrets that would not stay hidden for long. And Miss Marple, as always, was ready to follow them wherever they led. Later that afternoon, after the tea-room had quieted and the last of the gossiping neighbors had drifted home, Miss Marple made her way to Dolly Bantry's house. The manor, usually bright and welcoming, carried a faint tension in its corridors, as if the walls themselves were aware that something was amiss. She was greeted by Dolly, pale but composed, and by a nervous hush among the household staff. As Miss Marple entered the sitting-room, her eyes immediately began their subtle examination. A chair was slightly askew, not in a manner of casual carelessness, but as though it had been moved hastily. On a side table, a teacup rested with a slight tilt, almost as if the person who had placed it there had been interrupted. The famed necklace lay upon a velvet cushion, catching the sunlight in a way that made it sparkle almost hypnotic, but Miss Marple noted a tiny smudge on the clasp and a faint scratch upon the delicate chain itself. These minor details, invisible to anyone rushing to comfort Dolly, spoke volumes to her practiced eyes. The servants, polite but nervous, shuffled about, offering tea or excuses in equal measure. Miss Marple observed their glances and gestures with quiet care, the butler's stiff posture and slightly trembling hands, the maid's downward gaze, and the housekeeper's brisk but measured movements. Each told a story if one knew how to read them. Dolly herself spoke softly about the party, her voice calm yet tinged with unease. Miss Marple listened attentively, noting every hesitation, every careful choice of word. The simplest phrases sometimes hid the deepest truths, and the detective had long since learned that the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary. No one mentioned the letter found near the garden path, or the footprints pressed into the soft earth outside. The police had already dismissed these as inconsequential, and the villagers' gossip had overlooked them entirely. But Miss Marple catalogued each subtle clue, storing them like precious seeds to be examined later. By the time she took her leave, the atmosphere remained polite yet charged with unspoken tension. Outside, the autumn sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens. In that quiet moment, Miss Marple understood that the collapse at the garden party was only the beginning. Beneath the charming surface of Marleycombe, secrets stirred, and it would take nothing short of careful observation and gentle cunning to uncover them all. As twilight draped its soft violet hues over Marleycombe, the village settled into a gentle quiet, though a palpable unease lingered like a shadow over the Bantry estate. The manor's windows glimmered with candlelight, casting long, flickering reflections across the polished floors. Within, Miss Marple moved through the rooms with a serene patience that had become her hallmark, her mind piecing together the fragments of the day's unsettling events. The servants, ordinarily bustling with predictable rhythm, now whispered behind closed doors, their nervous movements betraying concern. Miss Marple quietly questioned them, asking casual yet pointed questions about the party, the guests, and the fleeting moments before Dolly's collapse. A subtle hesitation here, a too quick response there, Each tiny inconsistency was carefully noted. Even the faintest scratch on Dolly's wrist, overlooked by everyone else, drew her attention, hinting at an interaction that had left no obvious trace. In the sitting room, the heirloom necklace sat under the gentle glow of a lamp, its delicate sparkle almost accusatory. Miss Marple observed the way objects had been moved during the day, noting the slight displacement of chairs, a misaligned rug, and the telltale disturbance of flowers in the vase by the window. Each was a silent testament to someone's presence and movements, small details that, when woven together, could reveal much more than a hurried search or cursory glance might suggest. Outside, the village streets were hushed, the rustle of fallen leaves punctuating the night air. Within the manor, though, the tension was a living thing, a quiet hum beneath the veneer of civility. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp yet gentle, took in every subtle cue, the way a maid's fingers lingered on the edge of a table, the butler's measured, careful gait, the faint scent of a fragrance that didn't belong to Dolly. By the time she retired to her own quiet corner with a cup of tea, Miss Marple had already begun to construct a map of the day's secrets. The village, calm on the surface, held hidden currents of fear, jealousy, and curiosity. And though the evening appeared uneventful to the untrained eye, she knew that the threads of a far more intricate tale were already beginning to weave themselves together, threads that only careful observation, patience, and a keen mind could follow. A mysterious mark on the necklace catches Miss Marple's attention, hinting at deeper secrets yet to be revealed. Chapter 2. The Peculiar Threads of Clues. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight spilling across Marleycombe's cobblestone lanes and highlighting the golden tinge of early autumn leaves. Miss Marple, as was her habit, took a leisurely walk through the village, her mind occupied not by the beauty of the day, but by the subtle irregularities that often betrayed a hidden story. She wandered along the garden path at the Bantry estate, noting the faint impressions left in the soft earth, footprints too small and delicate to belong to Dolly herself, yet too precise to be accidental. The roses, their petals still glistening with dew, had been disturbed, not violently, but with a carelessness that seemed deliberate. A stem was bent here, a flower slightly displaced there, and a few fallen petals lay scattered in a pattern that only an observant eye could interpret. Miss Marple knelt for a moment, examining the soil. A fragment of torn lace, barely noticeable, clung to a thorn bush. Someone had moved through this space, deliberately or unwittingly, leaving behind a trail that most would dismiss as trivial. Passing the low stone wall bordering the garden, she noticed faint scuff marks on the path, evidence of a hurried exit, perhaps. She observed the spacing between the prints, the depth of each impression, the direction they trailed, details that would soon form the skeleton of the day's puzzle. Each irregularity, when taken together, suggested a presence at the party that no one had properly accounted for. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the manor's windows. From her vantage point, she could see a slight disturbance on the windowsill, dust displaced as if someone had leaned there briefly. A ribbon from the party decorations lay snagged and crumpled beneath the roses, as though it had caught on a passing hand. Each minor anomaly seemed insignificant on its own, yet she knew, as she always did, that the truth often hid in the quiet corners of ordinary life. Returning to the tea-room later, Miss Marple catalogued what she had observed in her mind, comparing it with the villagers' earlier accounts. Contradictions emerged quickly. Some claimed no one had lingered near the rose-beds, yet the traces she had seen suggested otherwise. Guest statements conflicted with each other, and subtle details that had seemed unimportant, an overlooked glance, a half-smile, a nervous shuffle, began to coalesce into a pattern. Even as the village carried on with its daily routines, unaware of the detective work quietly unfolding, Miss Marple felt the thrill of discovery. The garden, serene and fragrant under the autumn sun, had whispered its secrets to her. Footprints, bent petals, and disturbed dust had spoken volumes. With patience and careful attention, the seemingly ordinary could reveal extraordinary truths, and she was already beginning to see the threads that would lead to the heart of the mystery surrounding Dolly Bantry and her ill-fated necklace. By the time she returned to the manor, Miss Marple's mind was quietly alight with questions. Who had moved through the garden, and why? What small gesture had left such an indelible mark on the morning air? The day had begun with gentle calm, but already the delicate threads of intrigue were weaving themselves into a tapestry of secrets, waiting to be unraveled. Miss Marple's keen eyes rarely missed a detail, and on this particular morning, the subtle shifts in behavior among the Bantry household staff and village visitors did not escape her notice. As she sipped her tea in the quiet of the manor's drawing-room, she observed the maid, young Clara, moving about with a stiffness that seemed unnatural. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the cups, and her eyes darted to the corners of the room as if expecting someone or something to appear. A simple glance, a small gesture, often revealed more than words ever could, and Miss Marple catalogued each nuance with careful attention. The butler, usually the epitome of calm precision, now displayed a nervous briskness in his movements. He polished silverware with meticulous care, yet his eyes flickered toward the door each time it creaked. When asked about minor tasks, his answers were too precise, bordering on evasive. Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation before he spoke, the way he chose words carefully, almost as if weighing what to reveal and what to conceal. Visitors from the village came and went, bringing with them hushed questions and speculative glances. Some tried to appear unconcerned, laughing lightly at what they called village fuss, yet their fingers fidgeted with handkerchiefs or pocketed letters. Others lingered longer than necessary, studying the necklace from a distance, or whispering to one another in tones meant to be private but not quite so. Miss Marple's attention, as always, was drawn not to the overt expressions of fear, but to the tiny inconsistencies, a lowered gaze here, a half-smile there, gestures of subtle discomfort that spoke louder than any words. Even Dolly Bantry herself, recovering from her collapse, revealed clues in her manner. She seemed calm, yet there were fleeting moments when her eyes betrayed unease, glances toward the servants or at the necklace that suggested a worry she did not voice aloud. Miss Marple understood that these quiet cues, often dismissed by the casual observer, were essential threads in the fabric of the day's events. By piecing together these small behaviors, the maid's nervous energy, the butler's calculated evasions, the visitor's furtive glances, Miss Marple began to form a subtle map of suspicion and opportunity. It was not one overt act that would reveal the truth, but a tapestry of tiny gestures and contradictions, each weaving together to expose the hidden dynamics at play. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the manor felt alive with quiet tension. Polite conversation and the clink of china continued, masking the undercurrent of unease that Miss Marple quietly unraveled in her mind. Already, she suspected that the collapse, the whispers of curses, and the anxious behavior of those around her were connected in ways that would soon demand careful scrutiny, and clever deduction. Cliffhanger. Miss Marple notices a fleeting expression from the butler that hints he may know more than he lets on. The heirloom necklace, a glittering array of delicate links and a central pendant that caught the light with an almost hypnotic shimmer, had long been the source of both admiration and unease in Marleycombe. Miss Marple studied it now, resting carefully on its velvet cushion, her eyes tracing the subtle irregularities along its chain. There were faint scratches that suggested it had been handled more roughly than usual, and a tiny clasp that seemed slightly worn, a minor detail that, in the hands of the unobservant, would pass unnoticed. She recalled snippets of village whispers from previous owners, a sudden illness here, a financial ruin there, a broken engagement that seemed inexplicable at the time. Each tale, taken alone, appeared coincidental. Taken together, however, they formed a pattern that piqued Miss Marple's ever-curious mind. The stories hinted at misfortune that seemed almost to follow the necklace itself, a curious legacy woven into the very metal and gemstones of the piece. Visitors to the manor had all reacted differently upon seeing it that morning. Some drew near, fingers itching to examine the pendant, smiles polite but eyes betraying fascination. Others hung back, reluctant to be in its presence, as though the rumors whispered to them personally. Miss Marple noted the subtle cues, the tightened jaw of one guest, the quick glance of another toward the servant who had placed it there, the half-involuntary shiver that passed over someone who had long claimed disbelief in curses. She considered the possibility of a connection between Dolly's collapse and the necklace itself, not merely as a superstition but as a tangible element in the day's events. Small evidence, a smudge, a scratch, a slight misalignment, might seem trivial, yet could be decisive when interpreted correctly. The heirloom's past, wrapped in mystery and minor calamities, seemed now to reach forward into the present, touching the lives of those surrounding Dolly in ways subtle and profound. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the garden party, to the guests, to the silent interactions she had witnessed. The necklace was not merely jewelry, it was a silent witness, a keeper of secrets. And she knew that within its history, and within the small, telling signs of its handling, lay clues that could illuminate the truth behind Dolly Bantry's sudden fall. The key, as always, was patience, and the quiet art of observation. Miss Marple senses that the necklace's history holds the link to the true source of Dolly's misfortune, but the exact connection remains elusive. By late morning, the quiet tension at the Bantry manor had grown sufficiently noticeable to summon the local constabulary. Inspector Graves arrived with his customary brisk efficiency, straight-backed and confident, carrying the air of authority that often calmed the anxious and reassured the frightened. He spoke with Dolly, her household, and a few of the guests, questioning politely but firmly, as though the matter could be neatly wrapped in an hour or two. "I trust this was nothing more than a fainting spell?" he asked, glancing at the necklace, his tone casual, almost dismissive. "Accidents happen, you understand, even at the most genteel gatherings." Miss Marple, standing quietly to the side, noted his words with careful attention. His certainty was impressive, but it left little room for curiosity. While he scanned the scene for overt signs of foul play, Miss Marple's eyes took in subtler details, the slight smudge on the necklace's clasp, the displaced chair, the nervous shifts of those present. Every gesture, every micro-expression, was a puzzle piece that the inspector seemed content to overlook. The villagers who had accompanied Graves whispered among themselves. Some offered their accounts, others tried to embellish with conjecture. Graves, methodical yet seemingly untroubled by inconsistencies, accepted statements at face value. Miss Marple, however, catalogued contradictions quietly in her mind. The maid's hesitations, the butler's careful word choices, and the slight twitch of Dolly's nephew's hand when asked about the morning's events. As Graves concluded his preliminary inquiry, Miss Marple's thoughts were already racing. She understood that the superficial order he sought to impose would not reveal the truth. Patterns emerged only when one noticed the hidden movements, the subtle cues, the small details that went unremarked upon by most. A small bloodstain near the garden gate, overlooked by Inspector Graves, captures Miss Marple's attention. Its presence hints at a far more complicated story than anyone yet realizes. Chapter 3. The Wrong Suspect. The early morning mist clung to Marleycombe's cobblestones, softening the edges of the village and lending an eerie stillness to the Bantry estate. Most of the villagers were still wrapped in their dreams when the constables arrived, their boots echoing on the quiet streets as they approached the manor. Word had spread quickly that Dolly Bantry's collapse had taken a new, more troubling turn. Her nephew, Peter Bantry, was now a suspect. The household stirred in alarm. Peter, usually so composed and polite, had been roused from bed and confronted with the accusation. He protested vehemently, his voice shaking not from guilt, but from surprise and indignation. "I had nothing to do with it," he exclaimed, attempting to steady himself while the constables read the formal notice of his temporary arrest. His hands trembled slightly as he held them behind his back, not in defiance, but in an effort to appear composed. Outside, neighbors gathered quietly, drawn by the distant voices and the occasional shout. Some whispered in shocked tones, others speculated eagerly. "Peter? Surely not." "He's always been the sweetest boy," murmured Mrs. Weatherby to her companion. But the rumor mill churned quickly. Others suggested greed, inheritance, and secret resentments. Each opinion, offered in hushed tones, carried a weight of assumed knowledge that the villagers believed instinctively. Inside the manor, Miss Marple observed with calm detachment, as if the unfolding scene were a carefully arranged puzzle. She noted Peter's words, the tension in his posture, and the small, nervous glances exchanged between the staff. While the arrest appeared straightforward to most, she detected subtleties others overlooked. The timing of his arrival at the garden party, the trajectory of his movements, and the reactions of those around him. Nothing confirmed guilt, and yet nothing could be dismissed outright. The air within the Bantry home felt thick with speculation and quiet apprehension. Even Dolly, recovering but still delicate, seemed troubled not by Peter's potential culpability but by the ripple effects of the arrest. Miss Marple silently catalogued these reactions, aware that fear, loyalty, and surprise could all distort the truth. As the constables escorted Peter toward the waiting carriage, the villagers' whispers followed him like a shadow. Their speculation, fueled by fear and curiosity, transformed the ordinary morning into an event that would be remembered long after the incident. And yet, Miss Marple knew better than to accept appearances at face value. In every hurried step, every defensive gesture, and every whispered accusation lay a clue waiting to be understood. Despite the arrest, Miss Marple senses that Peter may not be the true culprit, and a deeper, more subtle scheme is at work behind the manor walls. As Peter Bantry was escorted away by the constables, the manor seemed to sag under the weight of its own unease. Guests and household staff alike murmured quietly, some offering sympathetic glances, others unable to resist a furtive peek at the young man's retreating figure. Miss Marple, however, remained unmoved in her corner, her keen eyes observing every nuance of the room. To the casual onlooker, Peter's arrest appeared a tidy solution, misfortune explained, gossip satisfied, but to her experienced mind, the situation was far from straightforward. Miss Marple's attention turned first to Peter himself. He had protested his innocence with earnestness that was difficult to feign convincingly. She noted the slight quiver in his fingers, the flush on his cheeks, and the rapid, measured breathing, all signs of genuine distress rather than calculated deception. His movements during the garden party, which she had carefully catalogued, aligned poorly with the notion of a deliberate act. Nothing in his behavior suggested premeditation, and yet the sudden collapse and the necklace's involvement demanded scrutiny. Her gaze shifted to the household staff, whose reactions were equally revealing. The maid who had fidgeted nervously during the tea-room gossip now avoided eye contact entirely, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The butler's composure had returned superficially, but subtle tensions remained, a stiff posture, a slight twitch of the jaw, and a careful, almost rehearsed politeness in his responses. Miss Marple knew from long experience that guilt and fear were not always aligned with the accused, and that small tells, tiny gestures, fleeting expressions, often betrayed the truth more reliably than a loud confession or dramatic claim. Even Dolly Bantry herself exhibited signs of uncertainty. She spoke softly about Peter's innocence, yet her eyes betrayed concern over matters she would not voice. Miss Marple considered the inheritance, the family rivalries, and the hidden resentments she had already observed. The neat surface of the manor's calm did not reflect the underlying currents she had begun to trace through careful observation, patient reflection, and the subtle inconsistencies in what people said versus what they did. As she moved quietly through the sitting-room, Miss Marple revisited her mental notes, the smudged clasp on the necklace, the faint scratch on Dolly's wrist, the displaced chair in the drawing-room, the footprints in the garden. Each detail, minor when seen alone, hinted at a narrative far more intricate than the simple accusation of Peter's involvement. She understood, with the certainty that only comes from experience, that the true culprit's presence was hidden in plain sight, disguised by distraction, misdirection, and the natural desire of villagers to resolve uncertainty quickly. By evening, while Marleycombe's household settled for the night, Miss Marple lingered in thought. Her doubts about Peter's guilt were not fleeting, they were rooted in evidence visible only to a discerning eye. And though the village may have accepted the apparent resolution, she knew that the real puzzle, with its web of motives, opportunity, and concealed intentions, was only beginning to reveal itself. Cliffhanger: a second minor theft at the Bantry house occurs, quietly complicating the situation and confirming Miss Marple's suspicion that Peter is not the true culprit. The following morning, Miss Marple returned to the Bantry estate, her mind quietly sifting through the events of the previous day. The household, still tense after Peter's arrest, moved about with a mixture of routine and apprehension. Visitors were now called one by one, questioned about the garden party and Dolly's collapse. Polite interrogations filled the sitting-room, each exchange careful, measured, and ostensibly innocuous, but Miss Marple knew better than to take words at face value. The gardener, Mr. Fletcher, claimed to have been tending the flower-beds all afternoon. Yet when pressed on minor details, he faltered, unsure of the exact time a particular rose had been pruned. The housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons, offered her testimony with polished composure, yet a subtle tremor in her voice betrayed anxiety. Even the neighbors, who had come with the best intentions to clarify the day's events, revealed contradictions in timing, positioning, and recollections of brief conversations. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the side, observed carefully. The nervous glance that the maid cast toward the butler, the fleeting frown that passed over Dolly's cousin, the way a visitor lingered near the window longer than necessary, all were small tells that marked where truth and pretense diverged. She compared each alibi against the physical evidence she had noted: the footprints in the garden, the disarrayed chairs, the subtle scratch on Dolly's wrist, and the minor smudge on the necklace. Some statements were convincing in their simplicity, honest in their hesitations and inconsistencies. Others seemed rehearsed, too precise, or delivered with a nervous emphasis that hinted at concealment. Miss Marple catalogued these patterns, recognizing which behaviors were genuine and which were performative. She understood that human nature, with all its small betrayals and slips, often revealed far more than any formal questioning could extract. As the interrogations concluded, the web of alibis remained tangled. The seemingly innocent accounts, when cross-referenced with minor observations, painted a picture far more complicated than the police report suggested. Miss Marple sensed the truth lay buried in these subtle contradictions, waiting for the careful mind to trace the connections. Miss Marple observes a minor but telling gesture from one of the staff, suggesting that the key to the mystery lies not in the obvious, but in the overlooked details of the day. As the sun dipped behind Marleycombe's gentle hills, casting long shadows over the Bantry estate, Miss Marple settled quietly in the village church, seeking the stillness that often sharpened her thoughts. The pews, empty but for the soft echo of the evening bells, offered a sanctuary where she could unravel the threads of the day's events without interruption. The faint scent of candle wax and old wood mingled with the crisp evening air drifting through the open doors. She thought of Peter Bantry, now in police custody, protesting his innocence with a fervor that seemed genuine. The inconsistencies she had observed in the testimonies of neighbors and staff suggested that the truth was far more complex than the village assumed. Motives were layered, subtle, and often invisible to those eager for a tidy resolution. Jealousy, long-buried resentments, and fear mingled with loyalty and affection, creating a tapestry of human emotion that only patient observation could untangle. Miss Marple reflected on the minor details that had caught her attention throughout the day: the faint scratches on Dolly's wrist, the smudge on the necklace's clasp, the misaligned chairs, and the scattered petals in the garden. These small signs whispered of a presence unseen, of intentions concealed. She knew that the solution lay not in the loud declarations of guilt, but in the quiet gestures, the overlooked moments, and the subtle patterns of behavior. As evening shadows deepened, she sensed that the mystery's threads were already converging. The apparent culprit might be innocent, the obvious explanations misleading. What truly mattered were the hidden motives and unnoticed actions, clues that could only be interpreted by someone willing to watch, listen, and think carefully. A second minor theft at the Bantry house comes to light, adding a new layer of intrigue and confirming Miss Marple's suspicion that appearances are rarely what they seem. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Roses. The morning sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of Dolly Bantry's sitting room, casting delicate patterns across the polished floor. Miss Marple, seated near the window, allowed her gaze to wander over the neatly stacked letters and diaries that had been unearthed in the course of her quiet inquiries. Each piece of paper seemed innocuous at first glance, yet she recognized immediately that they were fragments of a story woven long before anyone in the village could have anticipated. Old letters exchanged between Dolly and her distant cousin revealed a tension that had simmered over decades. Polite words on the surface concealed deep-seated resentments and subtle manipulations. There were references to overlooked promises, forgotten gatherings, and financial disagreements thinly veiled as casual complaints. One note, dated nearly 20 years prior, hinted at a dispute over a shared inheritance, with language precise but edged with a barely concealed bitterness. Another diary entry, written in a delicate hand, recounted an incident at a garden party, when one cousin's careless remark had caused Dolly considerable embarrassment, a slight that had never been forgiven. Miss Marple carefully considered each revelation. To the casual observer, these quarrels might seem trivial, the normal twinges of family disagreements. But when aligned with the recent events, the sudden collapse, the suspicious handling of the necklace, the subtle behaviors of staff and guests, the old feuds took on a new significance. Human nature, she knew, rarely changed. Grievances long buried could resurface with precise timing, motivated by opportunity or desire for redress. She noted the patterns: letters left unanswered, diary passages that hinted at minor revenge, subtle jabs masked by civil language. Even the timing of past events reflected a meticulous orchestration of slights and retaliation. The web of resentment was delicate, almost invisible, yet undeniably present. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, letting the soft light play across the pages. She realized that the collapse at the garden party, though ostensibly accidental, could not be divorced from these historical tensions. Hidden beneath the roses, both literal and metaphorical, were motives that had lingered for years, now subtly influencing the present. The village's seemingly calm surface masked a turbulent undercurrent, and the more she examined these old documents, the clearer it became that the roots of the mystery stretched far deeper than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple senses that the old family rivalry, long buried beneath politeness and propriety, is intricately connected to the recent disturbances, hinting at a hidden hand influencing events at the Bantry estate. The afternoon sun slanted across the Bantry estate, illuminating the fine details of the manor that often went unnoticed: the polished brass handles, the carefully maintained flower beds, and, more importantly to Miss Marple, the scattered documents that had been set aside for review. Among these papers were bank statements, account ledgers, and formal correspondence concerning the family's finances, mundane on the surface, yet revealing when examined with a careful eye. Miss Marple spread the papers across a table, her fingers tracing the neat columns of figures and dates. She noted irregularities: payments made under curious descriptions, transfers that coincided with minor disputes within the family, and loans that had been quietly extended and repaid in ways that seemed designed to obscure intent. The subtle manipulation of money, while invisible to most, spoke to motives far more practical than the whispered tales of curses and misfortune. A series of letters between Dolly and a distant cousin hinted at pressures and expectations. Some conveyed polite requests for assistance, others bore the formal, tight-lipped tone of negotiation. It was clear that financial entanglements, compounded over the years, had created fault lines beneath the family's outward civility. Miss Marple's mind drew connections between the monetary details and the recent disturbances: the timing of the garden party, the sudden attention to the necklace, and the subtle movements of staff and relatives. Even minor financial grievances could fester into resentment, she mused. The small gestures of annoyance, the deliberate avoidance of certain topics, and the faintly pointed remarks at social gatherings were all part of a carefully maintained dance. Money, she had learned, was rarely just numbers on a page. It shaped behavior, influenced decisions, and often provided the catalyst for actions that others dismissed as accidents or misfortune. As she pieced together the threads of the Bantry estate's finances, Miss Marple realized that the seemingly trivial irregularities were anything but coincidental. They reflected priorities, pressures, and perhaps even calculated schemes designed to manipulate perception. Every scratched ledger, every carefully worded letter, hinted at motives that went beyond mere inheritance. They revealed a subtle interplay of control, jealousy, and unspoken expectation. By evening, Miss Marple's mind had begun to sketch the contours of a financial web intertwined with the personal grievances she had uncovered earlier. The clues, faint yet persistent, suggested that the disturbances at the garden party were not simply the product of chance. Instead, they were influenced by a careful orchestration of opportunity, long-standing resentments, and the quiet pressures of money, all of which could converge in a single revealing act. Miss Marple senses that someone's manipulation of financial matters may have set the stage for Dolly's misfortune, and that the next clue will lie in the interplay between money and motive. As twilight deepened over Marleycombe, Miss Marple's attention shifted from letters and ledgers to the subtler threads of human relationships, those delicate connections that often went unnoticed but carried enormous influence. Among the documents she examined, she discovered hints of a romantic liaison that had remained carefully concealed. Affairs of the heart, after all, often flourished in shadows, undetected by polite society, yet capable of shaping decisions and behavior. The correspondence was discreet, phrased in vague terms that would appear innocent to anyone skimming the pages. Phrases such as, "I long to see you at the next gathering," or "Do not let anyone know of our recent meeting," suggested clandestine encounters and emotions held tightly beneath a veneer of propriety. Even small details, the timing of visits, sudden absences, and the subtle influence over certain household staff, hinted at alliances and secret loyalties. Miss Marple considered the implications carefully. Such attachments could easily create jealousy, resentment, or fear, all of which might surface in unexpected ways. Observing the staff and visitors, she noted behaviors that seemed influenced by these hidden connections. A fleeting glance exchanged between two individuals, a nervous hesitation when questioned, or a faint blush at an innocuous comment, all were small signs of entanglements that went beyond the obvious motives of inheritance or social propriety. The human heart, she knew, was often more telling than ledgers or letters. Miss Marple reflected on Dolly's collapse, the mysterious handling of the necklace, and the minor thefts that had occurred. Each incident could be connected to more than greed or curiosity. Emotional entanglements had the power to drive subtle manipulation and opportunistic actions. She understood that these hidden affairs, carefully veiled from the public eye, could amplify old rivalries and influence decisions in ways that were nearly invisible yet profoundly impactful. By the time evening settled over the manor, Miss Marple's mind was weaving together the dual threads of financial pressure and secret romance. She knew that to unravel the full mystery of Dolly Bantry's necklace, she would need to consider not only the tangible evidence but the hidden currents of affection, jealousy, and loyalty flowing quietly beneath the surface. Miss Marple senses that one of these secret relationships may be a crucial piece in understanding who truly manipulated events at the Bantry estate. By the following morning, Marleycombe had resumed its gentle rhythm, though the air was tinged with a renewed sense of curiosity. Word of the garden party, Dolly's collapse, and the subsequent arrest had spread quickly, and the village tea-room buzzed once again with speculation. Miss Marple, ever observant, arrived quietly, noting the subtle shifts in conversation, the careful phrasing of remarks, and the tiny hesitations that revealed more than the words themselves. The villagers whispered about new revelations, the letters and diaries that hinted at long-buried rivalries, the odd movements of staff, and the mysterious handling of Dolly's treasured necklace. Some expressed sympathy for Dolly, murmuring about the curse and the strange misfortunes that seemed to follow her heirloom. Others seized the opportunity to weigh in with conjecture, piecing together fragments of evidence they barely understood into elaborate theories of greed and deception. Miss Marple listened, cataloguing the reactions. She noticed relief in some, anxiety in others, and a faint glimmer of guilt in those who tried to appear unconcerned. The patterns were subtle but telling: the friend who laughed too readily, the neighbor who avoided eye contact when mentioning the Bantry estate, the casual comment that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Each reaction, she knew, was a clue to the deeper truth hidden beneath the village's polite chatter. Even minor observations, the way a cup of tea was nervously stirred, the careful avoidance of certain topics, the quick change of subject, added to her understanding of the dynamics at play. The gossip, though often distorted and embellished, was a mirror reflecting human motives, fears, and hidden allegiances. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had constructed a mental map of the village's undercurrents. The surface calm of Marleycombe masked a web of old rivalries, secret liaisons, and financial entanglements, all converging around Dolly Bantry and her ill-fated necklace. The villagers, unwittingly or otherwise, were playing their parts in a drama that had been quietly unfolding for years, now accelerating with every whispered word. A mysterious note, discovered in Dolly's handwriting and mentioned discreetly by a visiting neighbor, hints at an impending danger, suggesting that the seemingly peaceful village holds more secrets than anyone suspects. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Manor. The Bantry Manor, usually a picture of calm elegance, had acquired an air of quiet tension that seemed to seep into every corner. The morning sun glinted off the polished floors, but the light did little to dispel the unease that lingered like a shadow over the rooms. Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the drawing-room, noted the way the household staff moved with careful precision, their movements slightly too deliberate, as though conscious of invisible eyes. The manor, she realized, was no longer merely a home. It had become a stage for subtle schemes and hidden threats. It was during mid-morning, as Dolly sat in the sunlit conservatory with a small cup of tea, that the second incident occurred. A sudden coughing fit shook her, alarming the maid nearby, who called out for assistance. Miss Marple arrived promptly, observing quietly but with keen attention. The symptoms were mild, but the timing, so soon after the collapse at the garden party, immediately suggested that accident might not be the only explanation. Her eyes flicked to the tea, now cooling on the small table, and then to the surrounding items. Nothing seemed amiss at first glance, yet her instincts whispered caution. Guests gathered quickly, expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. Whispers about the curse gained new fuel, with murmurs suggesting that the heirloom might carry more than mere superstition. Panic, however restrained, crept into the household. Even those who prided themselves on composure now betrayed hints of fear. Miss Marple noted the slight tension in the butler's posture, the nervous fidgeting of the maid, and the casual glances exchanged by visiting relatives. Each movement was subtle, yet each spoke volumes. Miss Marple examined the scene with her practiced eye, noting patterns and small irregularities. A faint stain on the tablecloth, the precise placement of the tea set, and the position of a small decorative vase that had been shifted slightly. These details, innocuous to the untrained observer, hinted at deliberate manipulation. Even the smallest disturbance could reveal intent when viewed through the lens of careful observation. By the time the household had regained a semblance of calm, Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together potential motives and opportunities. She understood that old grudges, jealousy, and ambition could easily inspire seemingly minor incidents, small ripples that hinted at a deeper, more calculated plan. The manor's shadows, both literal and metaphorical, were alive with secrets, and the detective sensed that the day's second disturbance was but a precursor to more revelations yet to come. Miss Marple's eyes settled on a subtle clue in the conservatory, suggesting the second incident was no accident and that the true scheme behind Dolly Bantry's misfortune is far more deliberate than anyone realizes. After the minor poisoning in the conservatory, Miss Marple lingered quietly, her eyes sweeping the room with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime noticing what others overlooked. To most, the scene appeared innocuous: a cup of tea, a small table, and Dolly Bantry recovering with only a faint pallor on her cheeks. Yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn to details invisible to casual observers: the faint smudge on the silver sugar tongs, a subtle tilt of the teacup, and the delicate impression left by a finger on the edge of a saucer. Each anomaly, small and almost imperceptible, spoke volumes to her practiced mind. The maid, still visibly shaken, offered an account of Dolly's sudden illness, her words precise but her voice betraying uncertainty. The butler, with his usual composed demeanor, had overseen the breakfast arrangements, yet a slight hesitation in his explanation caught Miss Marple's attention. She noted that the arrangement of cups and plates differed from usual, minor disruptions that suggested interference by someone familiar with the household routines, but perhaps not meticulous enough to maintain consistency. Miss Marple examined the conservatory floor and furniture, spotting small but telling signs of movement: a chair slightly off its usual line, a vase that had been nudged, and faint footprints that hinted at hurried steps taken by someone who had not wished to be observed. These minor manipulations suggested premeditation, deliberate yet subtle, intended to escape notice. She catalogued each observation carefully, understanding that the seemingly trivial evidence could unlock the mystery if interpreted correctly. Letters and notes she had discovered earlier also began to connect with these physical clues. References to secret visits, hushed instructions, and small favors between household staff now took on a more ominous significance. The pattern of minor disturbances suggested a strategy: someone testing boundaries, observing reactions, and moving with deliberate subtlety to manipulate events in their favor. Miss Marple's thoughts circled around the broader implications. Old grudges, rivalries, and secret liaisons, already uncovered, seemed intertwined with the careful placement of objects and subtle disruptions in the manor. The web of motives was becoming clearer: not random misfortune, but calculated actions designed to unsettle, mislead, and obscure the truth. By evening, the detective had reconstructed a preliminary map of the events. Each small irregularity, the shifted furniture, the smudged silver, the disturbed flower arrangements, formed a chain of evidence pointing toward deliberate intent. Miss Marple understood that patience and observation, rather than rush or assumption, would reveal the hidden hand orchestrating these minor yet telling disturbances in the Bantry household. A pattern emerges from the small, overlooked clues, suggesting that the disturbances are connected, and that someone within the manor is carefully manipulating events for a concealed purpose. As the day wore on, Miss Marple retreated to the quiet of the library, letting the soft light of the late afternoon illuminate the rows of books and the scattered papers she had been studying. Here she could piece together the threads of motive, those hidden currents that guided human behavior, often invisible to all but the most attentive observer. She reflected on the recent incidents, the garden party collapse, the second poisoning, and the minor thefts, which, when considered together, hinted at intentions far deeper than mere mischief or accident. Miss Marple thought of the family's finances and the lingering disputes, recalling the letters that had revealed tension and resentment stretching back decades. Money, she knew, could inspire clever manipulation, but on its own, it rarely explained the nuances of human behavior. She considered the old rivalries, the subtle grievances long buried beneath polite conversation, and the hidden romances that colored relationships in ways the casual eye would miss. These emotional entanglements, when combined with opportunity, created fertile ground for deliberate interference and mischief. Even the household staff played a role in the dynamics. Small gestures, furtive glances, evasive answers, nervous movements, hinted at knowledge they were careful to conceal. Miss Marple realized that fear, loyalty, and ambition were all operating simultaneously, creating a complex web of motives. Every minor incident, the displaced chair, the smudged clasp on the necklace, the footprints in the conservatory, was part of a pattern, a signature left by someone seeking to manipulate perception while remaining hidden. The detective's mind also returned to Peter Bantry, still under suspicion. While the villagers' whispers and the official assumption pointed toward him, Miss Marple's understanding of human behavior made her skeptical. The true motive, she suspected, was concealed by layers of misdirection, embedded in the interplay of greed, jealousy, and the subtle machinations of those more patient and cunning than the casual observer could imagine. By evening, as shadows lengthened in the manor, Miss Marple felt the outlines of the puzzle beginning to emerge. The incidents were no longer isolated events. They were deliberate, interconnected actions guided by concealed motives. Understanding these motives would be key to unraveling the mystery, revealing not just the how of Dolly Bantry's misfortune, but the why. Miss Marple's quiet observations suggest that the next move by the true instigator will be deliberate and revealing, offering a chance to expose the hidden schemer behind the manor's recent disturbances. As dusk settled over the Bantry estate, casting a warm golden glow through the tall windows of the drawing-room, Miss Marple remained quietly seated, her gaze sweeping the room with the practiced patience of a lifelong observer. The household had resumed its cautious routine, yet subtle signs continued to betray unease. The slightly misaligned furniture, the careful but not quite natural movements of the staff, and the occasional glance exchanged between relatives that spoke of hidden anxieties. Miss Marple paid particular attention to small patterns, how the maid tended to adjust the tablecloth ever so slightly, the butler's precise but almost mechanical motions, and the way guests seemed to navigate the room as if testing boundaries. These minor disturbances, easily overlooked by others, were far from random. They revealed the presence of careful planning, deliberate movements intended to mislead or unsettle. Every small inconsistency, every barely noticeable gesture, became a thread in the fabric of her investigation. Her thoughts returned to the incidents themselves, the faint scratch on Dolly's wrist, the smudge on the necklace, the displaced chairs, and the subtle footprints in the conservatory. Each clue had a story, a purpose, and a relation to the others. She quietly compared behaviors, noticing which reactions were genuine and which were performed to divert attention. Miss Marple understood that truth often hid behind these gentle manipulations, revealed only through meticulous observation and reflection. Even the quietest corners of the manor seemed alive with hints. The gentle rearrangement of flowers, the slight disturbance of books on a shelf, the careful placement of personal items, all suggested someone who knew the household intimately but was acting with discretion. Miss Marple catalogued each of these details mentally, connecting them with prior events to form a clearer picture of the unseen hand guiding the disturbances. By the time the household settled into evening calm, Miss Marple's quiet vigilance had illuminated more than the incidents themselves. It had begun to reveal the patterns of the mind behind them. She knew that the deliberate nature of these movements, combined with the motives she had discerned, would soon point directly to the person orchestrating the chaos. The butler mysteriously disappears, leaving behind a cryptic note that hints at guilt, further complicating the puzzle and signaling that the true scheme behind Dolly Bantry's misfortune is far from resolved. Chapter 6. The Psychological Trap. Miss Marple sat quietly in her favorite corner of the Bantry drawing-room, the soft light of the late afternoon filtering through lace curtains, illuminating the array of letters, notes, and minor clues she had collected. Her mind, sharp and methodical, worked steadily to weave together the strands of human behavior, observation, and motive. It was clear to her that the minor disturbances, the sudden collapses, the smudged silver, the subtle thefts, were not random accidents. Someone was orchestrating events with deliberate intent, carefully testing reactions, and she needed a plan that would reveal the culprit without arousing suspicion. Her approach would be subtle, almost invisible. Miss Marple knew that the most effective trap relied not on confrontation but on conversation and timing. A well-placed comment, an innocuous question, or a casual mention of a particular detail could prompt the guilty party to reveal themselves, through words, gestures, or hesitation. She considered the pattern she had already observed: who reacted nervously to certain topics, who avoided eye contact, and whose composure faltered under minor pressure. Each small tell would be a piece in the larger puzzle of the trap she was about to set. Timing, she realized, was as crucial as observation. The suspect had been careful, deliberate, and patient. Only by choosing the right moment, when curiosity, pride, or fear nudged them into revealing too much, could she hope to draw out the truth. Miss Marple planned a casual gathering, one that would seem routine to all but allow her to watch the subtle interplay of reactions. Conversation would flow naturally, but every word and gesture would be measured, designed to illuminate the smallest cracks in composure. By the time evening descended over Marleycombe, Miss Marple had mentally constructed her strategy. The trap was simple in principle but elegant in execution, relying on the human tendency to react when confronted with carefully timed provocations. The stage was set. Now all that remained was patience. Miss Marple's plan to expose the hidden culprit hinges on a subtle psychological test. One small comment at the right moment will determine who among the Bantry household is hiding the truth. The following afternoon, Miss Marple invited a select group of villagers and Bantry household members to a casual tea party in the sunlit drawing-room. The atmosphere was deliberately unassuming: delicate china, fresh scones, and the faint aroma of lavender from the open windows. To the casual eye, it was merely a friendly gathering, a simple occasion to enjoy the calm of Marleycombe. But Miss Marple, seated quietly near the hearth, knew the subtle power of observation. Every gesture, every glance, every hesitation would be a clue. As conversation flowed, she carefully introduced topics designed to prompt reactions. She mentioned the garden party in passing, the minor disturbances at the manor, and even the enigmatic history of Dolly Bantry's necklace. Most guests responded with polite curiosity or mild interest, their expressions controlled, their movements measured. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught those small, telling reactions. A sudden stiffening of posture, a fleeting glance toward a window, the tiniest pause before answering a question. These were subtleties that only someone deeply implicated or burdened by guilt would betray. She watched the household staff closely as well. The maid's nervous fiddling with her teacup, the butler's carefully timed cough, and the slight redness creeping across a visitor's cheeks, all hints layered within ordinary behavior. To anyone else, these might seem trivial or coincidental, but Miss Marple recognized them as triggers responding to carefully placed conversational nudges. By the time the tea was nearly finished, the web of human reactions had begun to clarify. The casual, innocuous setting had revealed cracks in composure and subtle tells that illuminated the hidden tensions Miss Marple had been tracing for weeks. Each reaction, small yet significant, brought her closer to understanding who among the Bantry household was orchestrating the disturbances. A subtle reaction to a seemingly casual remark suggests the culprit is present among the guests, and Miss Marple's careful observation is beginning to corner them. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly as she leaned forward, lowering her voice so that the room felt intimate despite the number of people present. She casually mentioned a detail from Dolly's private letters, a minor disagreement, barely significant in itself, yet one that subtly implicated someone in the household. The comment was innocuous to most, a passing observation, but Miss Marple had chosen it carefully, knowing it would touch a nerve only with the guilty party. The room seemed to pause, the soft clinking of teaspoons momentarily overshadowed by a subtle shift in atmosphere. Most guests continued their conversation, unaffected, while a few glanced curiously but offered no emotional response. Then she noticed it, a fleeting blanch of the face, a tightening of the jaw, a sudden fidget with a napkin. The guilty party, whom she had observed for weeks, could not maintain the carefully constructed composure that had fooled everyone else. Miss Marple's strategy was simple but effective, observation coupled with psychological precision. The stress was small yet unmistakable, a crack in the veneer of innocence. Her sharp mind catalogued every micro-expression, every involuntary gesture. In that moment, the subtle trap she had devised began to reveal its results, bringing the hidden truth closer to the surface. The visible stress confirms the culprit's presence, and Miss Marple is now ready to confront the person responsible for the disturbances at the Bantry estate. A heavy hush settled over the room, as if the air itself had thickened. Miss Marple's gentle observations intensified, each glance, each shift in posture, now revealing layers of unease. The previously subtle tells had multiplied. Quickened breathing, a hand trembling slightly over a teacup, eyes darting to the doorway as if seeking escape. The culprit's carefully maintained calm was unraveling, thread by thread, under the quiet pressure of Miss Marple's orchestrated conversation. Guests continued to chatter politely, unaware of the undercurrent of tension weaving through the gathering. Miss Marple, however, noticed every micro-expression, the slight blanch of a cheek, the barely perceptible tightening of shoulders, the nervous glance at an object on a side table. Each reaction confirmed what she had suspected for days. The person responsible for Dolly Bantry's misfortune was present, trapped by their own emotions and unable to conceal guilt any longer. As she allowed the conversation to flow naturally, her practiced timing nudged the culprit further, their anxiety growing with each seemingly casual remark. Then it happened. A sudden movement toward the door, a hesitant step that betrayed panic. The carefully constructed veneer of innocence faltered. The suspect's attempt at a hasty exit signals that Miss Marple's trap is working, and the moment of revelation is imminent. Chapter 7. The Truth Unveiled. The drawing-room was still, the lingering tension from the tea-party hanging faintly in the air. Miss Marple, standing near the hearth, addressed the assembled household and villagers with calm authority, her sharp eyes glimmering with quiet satisfaction. She began to recount the events that had led to Dolly Bantry's recent misfortunes, her voice gentle yet precise, drawing everyone into the careful reconstruction she had built over weeks of observation. Step by step, she outlined the garden party, noting the subtle movements of chairs, the misaligned flower arrangements, and the faint scratches on Dolly's wrist, details dismissed by others but observed with meticulous care. She described the small disturbances in the manor, the smudges on silverware, and the minor thefts that had seemed inconsequential until viewed in context. Each piece of evidence, she explained, formed part of a larger pattern, revealing the deliberate orchestration behind what had seemed like accidents. The villagers listened, rapt and astonished. They whispered among themselves at the elegance of her reasoning, marveling at how seemingly trivial details, glances, gestures, and minor inconsistencies had been pieced together to form a coherent picture. Miss Marple's methodical approach transformed the scattered clues into a narrative that was both compelling and undeniable, leaving no doubt that the truth lay in the interplay of human behavior and subtle manipulation. As the evidence accumulates, the identity of the true culprit becomes increasingly clear, setting the stage for the dramatic revelation. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, settling on the figure who had so carefully concealed their intentions. With calm precision, she began to unravel the web of deception, identifying the true culprit, a seemingly innocent relative whose polite demeanor had fooled the village and authorities alike. The revelation sent a ripple of surprise through the gathered household, as whispers spread and faces turned pale. She explained how motive had been rooted in long-buried resentment, a mixture of jealousy, greed, and the desire for control over the Bantry estate. Opportunity had presented itself during the garden party, the careful placement of objects and subtle manipulations creating moments where minor incidents could escalate into misfortune. Miss Marple pointed out overlooked details, the faint smudge on the necklace clasp, the footprints in the conservatory, the nervous glances and subtle fidgets that revealed guilt long before words confirmed it. Her voice remained gentle, almost conversational, but each word landed with undeniable clarity. The web of small clues, once invisible, now formed a coherent picture. Villagers nodded in astonishment, realizing how much they had missed, and even the culprit could no longer maintain the mask of innocence. The elegant detective work had exposed the truth with quiet authority, demonstrating that no deception, however subtle, could withstand careful observation. The culprit, confronted with undeniable evidence, begins to falter, hinting at an imminent confession. A tense silence enveloped the drawing-room as the culprit's composure finally crumbled under the weight of Miss Marple's careful deductions. The relative who had appeared so polite and composed now sank into a chair, hands trembling slightly, and admitted their actions. Their confession was measured but unmistakable, acknowledging not only the minor thefts and disruptions, but also the subtle manipulations that had caused Dolly's collapse and the subsequent disturbances. A collective exhale swept through the villagers. Relief mingled with astonishment as the household processed the truth. The seemingly unremarkable neighbor, whose manners had never betrayed a hint of malice, had been the architect of the turmoil all along. Miss Marple's gentle but unwavering observations had left no room for denial, revealing the intricacies of human behavior that often go unnoticed. Dolly, now resting comfortably, received the news with a mixture of shock and gratitude. The village, long unsettled by the mysterious events, could finally return to its quiet rhythm. Conversations softened, laughter tentatively resumed, and a sense of restored order spread through the manor. Miss Marple, ever the observer, noted the subtle changes in demeanor, the easing of tension, and the cautious smiles that marked the return of calm. The truth, painstakingly uncovered, had liberated not only the Bantry household, but the entire village of Marleycombe from a shadow of uncertainty. Even as relief settles, Miss Marple quietly notices a small, lingering detail that hints human nature's secrets never fully vanish. With the culprit's confession complete, a sense of serenity gradually returned to the Bantry estate. Dolly, now fully recovered, moved through her home with a renewed lightness, the treasured necklace resting safely in its velvet case. The heirloom, once a source of whispered curses and suspicion, now lay quiet and undisturbed, a symbol of the restored harmony in the manor. Villagers, too, began to relax, exchanging tentative smiles and gentle laughter over tea and pastries. The household staff, who had endured days of subtle tension and unspoken fear, moved about with renewed composure, their earlier anxiety dissipating. Conversations, once laced with suspicion and gossip, softened into ordinary chatter about the weather, garden blooms, and upcoming village events. Life, for the moment, had resumed its usual rhythm. Yet Miss Marple, ever observant, remained quietly attentive. Her sharp eyes caught the smallest detail, a slight misalignment of a picture frame, a folded corner of a letter left carelessly on a side table. To most, these details were trivial, easily overlooked, but to her, they whispered that human nature's hidden depths could never be entirely smoothed over. Even in moments of peace, secrets lingered, subtle as shadows in a sunlit room. The village had regained its calm, but Miss Marple knew that beneath every polite smile and cheerful greeting, small mysteries still waited, quietly observing, patiently biding their time. Chapter 8. Calm After the Storm. The morning sun bathed Marleycombe in a soft, golden light, lending a serene charm to the village that seemed to have shaken off the shadows of recent events. Villagers moved through the streets with a quiet deliberation, exchanging smiles and gentle greetings, their conversations now reflecting introspection rather than gossip. Whispers of jealousy, mistrust, and hidden rivalries gave way to discussions of lessons learned, as each resident considered how small suspicions and pride had escalated tensions within the community. In the tea room, friends gathered over steaming cups of tea, quietly acknowledging the subtle ways human behavior could cloud judgment. Some spoke of caution, of the need to observe more carefully, while others reflected on how fear and envy could distort perceptions. The village, as a whole, seemed to breathe more freely, tempered by the awareness that harmony required attentiveness, patience, and empathy. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, seated near the window of her favorite nook, watched with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her mind traced the pattern she had observed, the faint gestures, the hidden motives, the delicate interplay of emotion and action. She mused on human nature with gentle amusement, aware that while the village had found peace, the undercurrents of behavior that had shaped the recent events would always remain, waiting to reveal themselves in the small, quiet moments of everyday life. In the weeks following the revelation of the culprit, the Bantry household slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Conversations once tense with suspicion softened, replaced by laughter, gentle teasing, and the warm comfort of routine. Dolly, fully recovered, welcomed relatives and friends with renewed warmth, her gracious manner restoring the manor's atmosphere of charm and hospitality. Old disagreements, once sharp and lingering, were addressed with patience and humility, allowing family relationships to mend gradually. The manor itself seemed to respond to this renewal. The gardens, previously slightly neglected during the tumult, were once again tended with care. Roses bloomed in vibrant colors, paths were swept clean, and the scent of freshly turned soil mingled with the aroma of tea and baking. Even the household staff moved with renewed cheer, carrying out their duties with pride and attentiveness, their earlier anxiety replaced by quiet satisfaction. Visitors to the estate noticed the transformation, remarking on the cheerful charm that now permeated every room and corridor. Miss Marple, observing these changes from her usual vantage point by the drawing-room window, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Harmony had returned, not by chance, but through patience, understanding, and the gentle unraveling of hidden truths, proving that even after turmoil, life in Marleycombe could resume with grace and warmth. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Miss Marple invited a small group of key villagers to her cozy sitting room for tea. The delicate china sparkled in the soft sunlight, and the scent of freshly baked scones filled the air. This was not merely a social gathering. It was a moment to reflect, to consider the intricate web of human behavior that had so recently come to light. As the conversation meandered, Miss Marple gently guided discussion toward the events surrounding Dolly Bantry's misfortunes. She spoke of morality, the subtle shades of right and wrong, and the complexity of motives that often lay hidden behind polite smiles and courteous words. Villagers listened attentively, occasionally nodding, sometimes exchanging thoughtful glances, as they realized how easily small grievances, jealousy, or pride could escalate into unforeseen consequences. Questions were raised about observation, trust, and the responsibility each person carried in a close-knit community. Miss Marple encouraged reflection, emphasizing that understanding human nature required patience, empathy, and careful attention to detail. The atmosphere was calm but contemplative, filled with the quiet realization that even in a peaceful village, the interplay of emotion and intention could shape lives in profound and surprising ways. By the time the teacups were empty, the villagers left with a renewed awareness of themselves and their neighbors, carrying Miss Marple's gentle wisdom into their daily routines. As Marleycombe settled back into its gentle rhythm, the streets once filled with whispers and speculation now carried only the soft sounds of everyday life, footsteps on cobblestones, laughter from the tea-room, and the occasional bark of a dog greeting its master. Flowers bloomed in tidy gardens, windows glimmered with sunlight, and the manor stood serene, as if the recent turbulence had never disturbed its walls. Life had returned to routine, yet Miss Marple remained quietly vigilant, aware that the calm could be deceptive. Seated in her favorite armchair, she reflected on the subtle currents that shaped human behavior, the fleeting expressions, whispered secrets, and carefully concealed intentions that could still ripple quietly beneath the surface. She reminded herself, and through her observations, gently reminded the village, that vigilance and careful attention were as essential as kindness and trust. Small details, often overlooked, could reveal far more than grand gestures or dramatic events ever would. Though the crisis had passed and order was restored, Miss Marple's keen mind noted every tiny irregularity: a letter left folded oddly, a teacup moved slightly from its usual place, a faint shadow in a familiar room. To the casual observer, these details seemed trivial, but to Miss Marple they were a reminder that secrets, like shadows, never entirely vanish. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us in the charming village of Marleycombe as we followed the twists and turns of the curse behind Dolly Bantry's necklace, a Miss Marple Mystery. From the crisp autumn mornings to the quiet afternoons spent in the tea-room, we have walked alongside Miss Marple, uncovering hidden motives, subtle clues, and the delicate threads of human behavior that wove this story together. The village has returned to its gentle rhythm. Fireplaces glow warmly in cozy sitting rooms, gardens flourish with roses and bright blooms, and the familiar sounds of daily life, footsteps on cobblestones, laughter drifting from the tea shops, and the occasional chatter of neighbors, once again fill the air. Yet, even in this restored peace, we are reminded that behind polite smiles and charming facades, secrets often linger, waiting for the keen observer to notice. Miss Marple's quiet attentiveness and subtle understanding of human nature have guided us through these events, revealing truths that others might have overlooked. Every glance, every gesture, and every minor irregularity played a part in uncovering the story behind Dolly Bantry's treasured necklace. If you enjoyed unraveling this cozy mystery with us, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what small clues in your own life have revealed bigger truths, or how you might approach a mystery if you were walking alongside Miss Marple herself. Until we meet again in another corner of Marleycombe, or perhaps a new village with its own secrets and surprises, keep your eyes open, your curiosity keen, and your mind ready to notice the small details that make all the difference. Happy sleuthing!